Hi, everyone. I'm BJ. I'm talking tonight about colonial Massachusetts. This is part two. I'll put the link to part one in the notes at YouTube if you're watching this. This is the silver books for Mayflower families. These are pretty much regarded as the state of the art on early Plymouth families. And so as I go through the published sources, these are one of the ones that I think are really handy because they are basically the Mayflower Society accepts what's in these for admission. And as we go through this, you can ignore these little signs. These are me starting to sort what's going where with the move. And one is the stuff that's definitely going and is going to be prominently easily available. But yeah, that's how I'm spending most of my time these days. So let's take a look at another published source. This is the Great Migration series. This is overseen by Robert Charles Anderson at the New England Historical and Genealogical Society. And this is an attempt, they started out with 3 volumes, and you can only see 2 of them here, trying to catalog everybody who had immigrated to New England between 1620 and 1633.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
We're seeing your screen, the blank screen with the book on the bottom and the tree. We're not.
Oh,
sorry.
I'm really doing well tonight, guys. It's been one of those weeks, let me tell you. Okay, so here's the Great Migration begins. And as I said, you can see that there's a third one, volume 1 I cut off. And basically Anderson tried to track down every reference to each of the early settlers. And he gives sources for everything. And when we finish this, I'm going to go into, if you're a member of American Ancestors, you can, this one you can get online. This is part of the American Ancestors database that's available, which is really handy for those of us who don't want to have to buy these books or haul them around if we've bought them. So after they did the first 3 volumes to 1633, which took 3 volumes. They started doing 1634 and 5, and that is 6 volumes. And then they're going to go through the spring of 1641, which is essentially when the Great Migration to New England ended. So if you have ancestors that go back before 1641, they're really only up to about 1636 and 7 now. Anderson is retiring, but someone else is taking over the project. It is continuing despite his retirement, which is very good. I mean, like with the Mayflower books, these are pretty solid. Everything is sourced, so you can go back and look at the original, and they're often my first stop if somebody comes in with a 17th century question, because even though they only go up to the 1630s, you remember what I said last week, where from 1641 up through the mid 1700s, there wasn't that much immigration. And so the chances are pretty high that even if the person's only back to the late 1600s, if they come in with a couple's name, one of the 2 families almost certainly goes back to this. And it gives me the references, if there's an article or a family history that's worth looking at, it will be indicated in the sources here. And as I said, once we flip to me sharing in my browser, I'll go into that and show you guys what that looks like inside. Oh, come on. I really am having a hard time here, people. And the cat's not even in the room. So also from the New England Historical and Genealogical Society, as you can see, they've done a 1-volume Immigrants to Plymouth Colony, not all of Massachusetts, but this is 1 volume that is all of those who immigrated in that first chunk to Plymouth. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute and turn my video on. I actually have the paperback version of this. And I don't know if you can see it, but every one of those Post-it notes is one of my ancestors. So I decided it was worth the 30 or 40 bucks that this book costs. That at that rate, it was cheaper than photocopying and a lot saner. And this very much, it's basically reprinting with a few updates what was in the Great Migration. But if your ancestors do go back to Plymouth, it's worth getting because it will, or at least looking at, because it has everything in 1 volume. And it is now, let me look. List price is $30 in paperback. So that's not a bad deal if you've got several ancestors in Plymouth. They've also put out, and there's a more recent one that actually goes through 2010 of this, but it was in the new building, not the old building where I was taking photos. This is a basically an index to journal and magazine articles in the modern era about early New England settlers. And so the reason I use this is often to combat all the misinformation that's out there. There have been a lot of articles written in the last 30 to 40 years that correct things that were not done well. And yeah, I will put all of these in the handout that I'm putting together for this. So including the reference to the newer one of this. Now, this is the Maine in 1790 series that the Maine Genealogical Society is putting out. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning this, there's a similar project for Vermont and one for Western Massachusetts. But a lot of these families would have started in Eastern Massachusetts. And so the vast majority, I would say, of the families in these books, the oldest generation mentioned because what this is doing is it's taking each head of the household in the 1790 census and trying to do a genealogical sketch for that family. Because if you remember, that census just has 3 columns of tick marks for those who were white. And then I think it was just 1 for non-whites. And so you would just get a list of 2 males under 16, 1 male over 16, and 4 females in the family. And so this project is being done to try to figure out who was in all of those, who were all of those tick marks, basically, on the census. And as I said, a lot of this case, you're going to find that the head of the family was born in Massachusetts. Not all of them, but a considerable majority, I think, would be a reasonable way to go. And so it is worth, if you're stuck in that late colonial period, this is a really good thing to think about is, did somebody from that family move to one of these places away from the center of settlement in eastern Massachusetts, Rhode Island, southern Connecticut, into one of the areas where there's a project like this going on because there are so few records? Does that make sense to everybody? So then there are periodicals. This is the old man of them. It's the New England Historical and Genealogical Register. Oldest genealogical publication in the world. It's available online, again, with an American Ancestors subscription, or if you're in a library that has an institutional subscription. These are actually, with the move, going into storage because our copies, like most people's copies, are really fragile. And because they're available online, it was not my favorite decision to have to make, but I decided that they take up a lot of space, and half the time I help people pull up the online version anyway, because the original that we have is too fragile to photocopy. So they take up almost a whole side of an aisle of our genealogy collection. So, it's 160 plus years now of these. And the late 1800 ones, I mean, they crumble if you look at them wrong. And Scout just decided to stop sharing my screen. Sorry about that. No, seriously, he flipped his tail. Yeah, when I record for the big fancy conferences, I think I'm doing it at work. So anyhow, that's a good thing. And with this, the quality varies. Particularly more recently, it's excellent. I'm actually in the middle of writing a report / article on an ancestor of mine who was a member of NEHGS in the 1850s, died in 1889. For some reason, they did a memorial to him in 1943, and it is full of mistakes and sent me on about 7 different wild goose chases. And so I'm basically writing one of my proofs for becoming a certified genealogist, straightening this out, because it's just, so particularly before the 1970s, the quality can vary. So keep that in mind. Oops, let's go back to the slide. There are a lot of other periodicals. And here we have both the Mayflower Descendant and the Mayflower Quarterly. They're separate journals. And so the Mayflower Descendant is now online at New England Historical and Genealogical Society. Again, if you have a membership there at American Ancestors. And again, like with the register, the more recent articles are going to tend to be better sources, but the older ones sometimes give you good hints. This is the Connecticut Nutmegger, which covers Connecticut, not surprisingly. This is an older one done by a man named Eben Putnam that focuses on Essex County, Massachusetts. He's got a lot of good early stuff. Again, it's late 19th century, so it doesn't have the sources the way we would expect something today, but it's definitely a good source for Essex County. And And he was sort of the first of the ones, even though he doesn't have sources to the modern level, he was one of a small group in that generation who was trying to be better than just writing down family stories. The other one I didn't get a picture of is the American Genealogist, which also covers a lot of New England families and is also online at American Ancestors. You also get, and these are technically not genealogical publications, but they often have a lot of interesting genealogical information about them. We've got the publication of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and the Essex Institute Historical Collections. The Essex Institute is now part of the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. So these tend to be focused on Essex County. This is on colonial Massachusetts. There's also a series that's the Massachusetts Historical Society. And some of what happens is when you get back into the colonial era, the genealogical and the historical often overlap considerably. And so you will get articles in these written from the same sources we're using, even though they're looking at sort of the historical / local history bits, and we're looking at the genealogical, say, out of court records. There's a lot of good stuff in these. And so, and these are indexed for the most part. You can see, for example, here's one. This is Suffolk County Court, so that's Boston. And so these are transcribed court records for Boston in these 2 volumes. So can you, anyone who has ancestors who lived actually in the city of Boston, can you see how that might be helpful? Some of these, like these are transactions of the modern society. That's going to be less helpful, but these are very helpful. I use those fairly frequently. There are other what I call collected genealogies, and these are of various qualities. There's another one that's someone who looked at the ancestors of his 16 great-great-grandparents. This is Gary Boyd Roberts looking at 600 immigrants who were tending towards the upper class in colonial New England. And they were often the second sons of gentry, where, you know, you'd had progressive second sons go slightly down the social scale. But these aren't necessarily, again, as well sourced as a modern version would be. These are pretty good. Some of the others done in the 1950s and 60s aren't as good. But again, you get people who may have known their great-grandparents writing. Some of these will be by town, some will be, there's one called the Sherman Directory that's trying to trace every Sherman in colonial New England. I've seen these for, like there's one for the town of Watertown, Massachusetts, where it was, you know, it's the early prominent families. So they're done for various reasons, but they're not periodicals in the sense of they come out on a schedule, but they're also not really a family history because they're multiple families that fit within a larger category. So to some extent, the Maine and 1790s project fits into this category as well. Does that make sense to everybody? That there are a lot of these for various places and times and family names in colonial New England. There are some non-genealogical records that have been printed. This is the Quarterly Courts of Essex County, Massachusetts, going back to 1636. Now, with everything, I would highly encourage you, if you have a reference to one of these, yes, look it up in this to read the transcribed version. These are online at places like archive.org. This way, but you can also get, through places like Ancestry and Family Search, microfilmed copies of the originals. And so it is still worth going back, but if you're having trouble reading the handwriting, these have been transcribed by people who know how to read the handwriting. Does that make sense to everybody? How these could be useful? And finally, the TAN books, which aren't always TAN anymore. This is one of the originals here for Acton, Massachusetts. Here's Roxbury. As you can see, the library's copy for Salem, I didn't look to see whether this was it's either a reprint or a rebinding. These are actually archival boxes, not the book you're seeing here for Marblehead. These were done in the late, well, basically in the early 20th century from the vital records and other sources. So I'll show you again when we get to this. So some of these will have things where it'll have a code saying GR for gravestone record or CTR for court record. And you have to look at the beginning of the book to see what it is. But these also did extract the actual vital records for a town. They looked at church records, particularly by the early 1800s. They also looked at some newspaper records. But until recently, for about 100 years from when these were published, until you started getting original records digitized, these were regarded as being about as good as the originals because they were easy to access. They have good points and bad. They do things, they either lump all of the spellings of a surname together, or at the beginning, they tell you to see also and list those. They tell you, for the most part, about variations. If you have two records of an event and there's a variation between the two, it'll tell you that variation. They did do some things like if a town did a family register style vital records where they put the parents' names and then the children rather than by date, they put everything in alphabetical order for the most part. They cover about half the towns in Massachusetts. So, and again, like with the silver books, these are something that almost any decent sized genealogical library will have a selection of these. So, you know, the State Library here in Maine has them, the Maine Historical Society, Bangor has a bunch, Belfast Free Library has a bunch. There are times I still use them. They're easy, you know, if I'm working with trying to figure out who goes with whom within a surname, it is still sometimes easier to skim the pages. But like with many of the early New England Historical and Genealogical Society registers, some of these are now in bad enough shape that you're going to end up printing it from the computer, from the online version. And once you see the inside of one of these, you'll recognize all of them because they were pretty much done in the same style. They were actually published by various different organizations. So there's not one specific publisher, but they do all look alike inside. But that's one reason there's slight variations in how they did things, is different organizations did them. The reason they did them to 1850 is, and I talked a bit about this last week, in 1841, Massachusetts was the first state with a modern requirement for keeping vital records. And so in the 1840s, all the town clerks were supposed to make a copy of the records they had and send that copy to Boston. And so the idea was that after 1850, from a genealogical standpoint, there's a copy in Boston for every year. Now, some of those have copying errors, but it's the up to 1850 was scattered. And yes, supposedly there was a copy sent when in the 1840s, but the originals were still scattered. And so that's why they chose 1850 on these. It was also then 50 plus years, and so early privacy concerns. So that's the end of the PowerPoint. So let me stop sharing this screen. And any questions at this point before I go into showing you stuff online?
BJ, it's Nancy. Are the 10 books available online?
Yes. They are actually the first thing you will get as a hit at Ancestry and MyHeritage or Massachusetts Vital Records. You have to go digging for the handwritten originals.
Okay. And there was another one you mentioned. The 1790s. Are they available?
No, those are only in print. And I can tell you that the only way to get volume 3 is to buy the entire set. Because Picton Press printed that and owns the copyright, not MGS.
Okay.
And
so,
Picton Press is out of business.
right.
So if you ever see a volume 3 for a reasonable price, grab it. And if you don't want it, somebody will buy it from you, I'm certain.
For any price.
I bet it'll be hard to find. So in the time period that we don't have, well, are you taking the 1790s with you to the new setup at the library?
Oh yeah, they're going in the quick. I was saying before you came on, I'm actually dividing the genealogy collection into a couple parts at the new place.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is going, the first thing will be the stuff everybody uses. You know, so the sorts of things I showed you tonight are going to be in the first section. And I don't know if you have a great name for, I'm calling it the featured collection internally. Okay. Which isn't really, but it's also not quick reference. I haven't come up with a good phrase for it. And then we'll have the depth of the collection, and then we'll have the Canadian stuff all together. Because I know people who come in for just the Canadian stuff. So I'm putting all the Canadian stuff together because that makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. But you know, a lot of these things that are the well done stuff, the stuff that's highly reliable, and the methodology stuff is coming out in the first row or two of books. And then I'll have the mass of all the town histories and all of that. But I think it's going to make the library more user-friendly. Mm-hmm. So anyhow, let me get into American Ancestors so I can show you.
One piece you just mentioned was the community histories, town histories.
Yeah.
To what extent? Because you have an incredible collection of these.
What we're doing, and I'll talk about this momentarily as I get into.
Okay, you go ahead and do it then.
No, as I'm finding the right place to get into the Great Migration books. Let me go into here. We're taking the library use only copy to the new location. And the circulating copy and any other copies we have, because there's some of these that we have 3 to 6 copies of are going to the offsite stacks. And my reasoning for this is this way, there will always be a copy in the library. And if you want to order one, if you want one to take home, if we have a circulating copy, we can request it to get then sent to your local library through the van service, and you'll get it in a couple days to a week, depending on how often your local library gets things. And you can take it home that way. But I decided it was easier to do this, because if we took the circulating copy to the new library location, if somebody else had come in a week earlier and taken out the volume you wanted, we wouldn't have it in the library. And this way we will.
That's
So,
excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out the least disruptive way to do this. And it's not been fun.
But your systems that you're creating are phenomenal. So
yeah, and the thing I've made it clear to my boss is I want to make sure that we have a no more than 72-hour turnaround, and we're aiming for 48 on getting things from Winthrop, where the storage is going to be, to us on State Street. So that if you know, and we are trying to, I'm also pushing for us to put something together so you can request things before you come and they're waiting for you. So those of you who live more than 5 minutes away can say, you know, I'm coming on Tuesday, you know, it's Thursday, I'm coming next Tuesday. Can you have these 3 books that are only over in the closed stacks ready for me? And the answer will be yes. Does that make sense?
yes, it sure does. That's going to be incredibly helpful.
Well, and this is how lots of libraries, I mean, this is how you do things at the National Library of Scotland, Library of Congress, a whole bunch of other places, just because if you're a library that doesn't weed, which is what most genealogical libraries are, you end up running out of space. There's just no way around it. And you know, at least we've got one that's going to be routinely about a 15-minute drive, as opposed to DC. You know, we have no DC or Boston traffic to have to deal with. So, okay, so here, this is the inside of a Great Migration book for John Alden, and they're all set up the same. It's, you know, their origin, when they came over, where they first settled, and anywhere they went to, then occupation. Was he on a list of freemen of the colony? If education is known, if they served, and notice this entire thing is sourced. Every one of these things has a source. And the sources are all outlined at the beginning of the book. And if we go on, you can see, you get all sorts of things. He was assigned mowing ground. He gave his son land in Bridgewater. Here's other information. And let's see. And then you get to what's known about birth, death, and marriage, children with spouses. This doesn't cover past their children, really, unless there's a reason to put a grandchild in. Comments, and let's see. And obviously there's a lot known about him. What this doesn't have, on some of these, you'll get a category called connections. And if people had known associations from before they moved to New England, say it turned out he was a cousin of somebody, or he came as a servant to someone else, those sorts of connections will be listed. And like, notice here, it says by entering Southampton under origin, we are only taking note of Bradford's statement that Allen was hired at that port. We are not implying that he was born or raised there. And it's actually not known, if I remember correctly, that where he came from. This is also the sorts of things Anderson did. Here it says some accounts of the family include a son, Zechariah. In 1948, Halleck P. Long demonstrated that this son never existed and that Anna Alden was almost certainly the daughter of John Alden's son, Jonathan, and a reference to the article about that. And this is part of the reason I wanted to show you this one, is that there's a whole lot of this kind of misinformation floating around about the early New England families, because people want to, now in this case, she's still a granddaughter and therefore a Mayflower descendant, but you get other cases, for example, with people named White wanting to go back to the William White who was on the Mayflower. Well, I've seen way too many Smiths in Essex County where they've tried to stick them into the family tree of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. And you just can't assume that every Smith in the Middleton, Topsfield, Danvers, Peabody, Salem area is related to the family that produced Joseph Smith. And so this is one of the reasons I wanted to, I was debating how to do this, and I decided it was worth going through and show, and it was actually, I was looking at this for something else, and I saw this, and I'm like, I've got to talk about this. That one reason I like this series is that Anderson does go through and not only about what he's found and sources it well, and gives you all of the, every reference pretty much he's found to the person. He gives you this doesn't work. This person doesn't fit in this family, which when you're dealing with these early families that some people see as prestigious, you want to be careful, because people will make these connections that they shouldn't. Okay. Is that clear to everybody? So this whole series looks the same. And so, if we go into that Pilgrim Migration book I held up, it's basically reprinting this. There are a couple cases, I think, where they have found, information has been found since the early Great Migration was printed. Caleb Johnson and a couple other researchers have actually, as things have been digitized and made more accessible, there are some discoveries that are being made. I figure I'm not going to, there are enough people looking for where John Alden came from. The chances of me being the one finding him are pretty small. The estimates I've seen are that there are somewhere between 2 and 8 million people alive who descend from this couple. Because if you look at their kids, I think all of them, or all but one of the 10, there's only one or two that didn't have children. And all of the ones that had children had like 10 children. And it doesn't take too many generations of that before you suddenly have immense numbers of descendants. So the other thing I wanted to show you here, let's go back to the search. So I'm going to go into the advanced search because I want to show you. Oh, this is the other thing that's just come on. They've worked with the Mayflower Society and Family Search to digitize all of the Mayflower Society membership applications. For anyone who on an application who was born before 1920, which is an immense amount of data. And again, the older applications are going to have some things that may not pass muster these days, but it's a good place to start. This is the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. And so this was a project that was supposed to have lots of publicity and big parties and such. And obviously that hasn't happened, but it did go online. So this is there. And I'm not trying to sell you an American Ancestors membership, I promise. Several libraries in Maine have an institutional membership. Belfast does, the State Library does, I think Scarborough does. And if you see, they've got all sorts of things. They've got the American Genealogist. I think they've got the Connecticut. No, they don't have the, yeah, they have the Nutmegger. So if you're looking at colonial New England, they do periodically have sales on their memberships. So it may be worth watching, and if you see one, but yeah, so then this early New England families is being done by another genealogist with them. And it's looking at people who came after the Great Migration, often in Western, settled further west. The Essex Antiquarian's another one, like that Putnam's Genealogical magazine that I showed you, from the late 1800s, early 1900s on Essex County. They have some vital records here that aren't other places. So like Farmingdale, Maine, Gardner, and here you can see that whole list of Great Migration. And the newsletter is interesting. It was their talk about the project, and we have the collated volume of those at the library. So they've also got the Georgetown, I don't know if you've seen this, about Georgetown University, the slaves they sold to fund the university. It's been on some news programs. So that's an interesting database. So, when I say there's a lot online, there is a lot online that's been public. Not all of those are what I'd call published, but many of those things are scanned books. So let's take a look at some of the vital records. This is an original. As you can probably tell from the handwriting, this is baptisms from Middleton, Massachusetts in the 1770s. And a couple interesting things here. One is this minister was really good about putting the mother's name in, which is not always the case. Some ministers I've found, I think what's happening is they put the parent who's the church member, because after the late 1600s, you could have a child baptized if only one parent was a church member. By this point, you are beginning to get some families where you get multiple children baptized on the same day who may not be twins. Earlier, you almost always see the children baptized within a week or two of when they were born. But by this point, you are getting, here's a family it's a widow brings 4 children, and they were not quadruplets. And here's 3. And this one's also interesting. There must have been 2 ministers in town by this point, because it does tell you which minister baptized them in some cases. So this is what an original looks like. Let's go. Here's one of my, actually, this is Middleton marriages. This is the inside of the tan books. And here's the one I'm interested in, Ithamar Wilkins. And what they've done here is they've just alphabetized them. And then within the alphabetical, it's by date. And you'll notice, so you have Elizabeth with an S separated from Elizabeth with a Z. And given spelling conventions or the lack thereof at the time, you would want to check both spellings. And I've only once seen Elizabeth spelled with an A in a record. I think because it was biblical, the ministers tended to know how it was spelled. But I would check A. Esther and Hester would have been interchangeable. Anna and Hannah might be, you would want to look under both if you're not finding the person you're looking for. So let me, and you see here how you have CR. So that's on this one, it's a cemetery record. You have other codes you'd have to look at. So let's look at my Ithamar. He is one of my problem ancestors. He leaves just enough traces that I feel like I should be able to find him, but I can't. So here we have Ithamar, and then what they did, if it is something that is a variation from another record, they've put it in square brackets. So this says Thomas and DC, and DC is the source code. And for the Middleton records, this does not mean death certificate. This is why you want to check the list of abbreviations at the beginning of the book. This actually means Dorman copy. And I explained this last week, but I'm going to show you again, because somehow Moses Dorman had real interesting fun with this family when he copied stuff. In the 1840s, when they were copying the records, as I said earlier, to go to Boston, for some reason, Moses Dorman wrote Thomas's name, or wrote Ithamar's name as Thomas. And you'll see this is a marriage record, and it says he married Lois, blank. And when I first saw it, I figured, oh, that must mean he couldn't read her last name. Well, actually, let me find the right one here. First of all, having looked at this, I can kind of see how he got Thomas out of Ithamar. I don't want to blow it up so big you can't see it because it's scritchy, but you have Ithamar Wilkins and Lois, June the 3rd. So yes, in the original, there is no last name for Lois in her marriage record. My current hypothesis is she was actually a second cousin of Ithamar's, and so her name was already Wilkins, because that is not that unusual in this time and place. I have several cases where a Putnam married a Putnam, or an Upton married an Upton, or a Flint married a Flint, or a Flint married a Putnam whose mother's maiden name was Flint. And so that's my current working theory, but this is the original. And as you can see, these are not always easy to read. And you'll see they alternate seemingly randomly between Wilkins with 1 L and Wilkins with 2. And so when you look at these, you have to go back to the beginning of the, so in this one, you would look for Wilkins with 2 L's separately. Some of the towns, it would say alternately or also or something like that, and they would have put all of these together. It depended on who was putting it together, how they did it. But as you can see here, you get the various Benjamins. They don't alphabetize by the junior and third. And so within the Benjamins, you'll see they're in date order at that point. You can see here's another one where, yeah, it's, the originals were hard to read. But once you've opened up, and this is what you almost always get as the default for the early entry, you know, the early returns in a search at Ancestry and MyHeritage for these vital records. Yeah, that's, and you have to kind of, you can tell here, if you can see that it looks like a printed page, and that one does, and let's go down. This one is a printed page, one of these. Here's, I can tell you, this is the Dorman copy from the 1840s. And then that's an index. That's actually not a vital record. That's, I'll get to the tax records at some point. And, but you can tell looking that that's going to be a handwritten one. And here's the one that's the handwritten. And so just by taking your mouse just over here, you can see what you're getting. Now, I fully endorse using something like this to start with, because it's going to be easier to read. You know, if you're just starting on a family and you're trying to figure out some level of who's who and so on, start with this. That's fine. But before you draw any final conclusions, go back and find the handwritten versions. Does that make sense to everybody? There will be people who will tell you, oh no, you just go straight to the handwritten. And I can tell you, I'm relatively good at reading the older handwriting. This will not drive you as crazy. You know, these are done well enough that, as I said, for about 100 years, they were considered as good as the originals. And they're not, as you can see, in some ways, but on the other hand, they bring together information from multiple places, and it is where you will get sometimes cemetery records or newspaper records. The Salem book, I think, is the one that has a lot of Bibles that are at the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum. And so, you know, you're not going to get those easily online. They have not been digitized. But, you know, they were, when they did these tan books, they did go through them. So I see, I told you this was going to go more than 2 sessions. So, yeah, I have a feeling this is going to turn out to be like the census one, where, you know, instead of being 3 sessions, that went to 8 or 9. I hope I don't go quite that far, but there's a lot of material here. If you go back before the revolution, you are going to get a lot of material. So this is a somewhat convenient stopping place. I'll do more on marriage and death records and how the marriage records worked with intentions in 2 weeks. because it's a process that's not that dissimilar to how we do it today, but you just want to make sure that you understand the process. So any questions at this point?
DJ, it's Dana. I have a comment.
Sure.
One of the best sources I found for early name families is the Noyes-Libby-Davis Genealogical Dictionary of Maine and New Hampshire, which they basically try to cover everyone who was living in Maine up to about 1700, a little thereafter. And because many of those families came from Massachusetts, you'll find a citation as to where they came from. And it's a good way to track from Massachusetts into Maine.
Yeah, and that was one of the collective genealogies that I meant to photograph and got interrupted and didn't. I am putting together a massive handout to go with this. And that's one that will be in there because it is one of the more reliable sources, printed sources. But yes, on these, a lot of these families, somebody's already done the hard work on. Now, in some cases, like my Ithamar Wilkins, he's mentioned in the Wilkins of Danvers, Middleton, Topsfield book, but there's nothing beyond his birth and that marriage entry. But yeah, some of the earlier collected genealogies are pretty shaky, but that's one that's good. And the others I've mentioned. Yeah, I don't know exactly when Picton went out of business, but it was within the last, maybe 10 years ago, something like that. You need to be in the library to get into American Ancestors. You need to be on our network. And we're not open at the moment. I don't know if Scarborough's open. I think Belfast is basically open for drop off and pickup. I don't think they're allowing people extended, and it's too cold to sit in the courtyard. And
Belfast is open
it is it actually open for people to go in and research?
by appointment.
By appointment, okay. So if they have a subscription to American Ancestors, or at least they did the last time I checked. And I'm pretty sure that's something they would have kept. I don't know if Bangor's open. I think they may have one as well. But it's always worth a call somewhere. And I'm really hoping we're going to be open by January or February. I'm not optimistic. I'm right now, if I had to put money on a time, what month would we open? I would probably put it on March right now. Because, but evidently they're in the deciding the bid on the mover stage, which is sort of a critical piece because I can't do some of what I need to do until the mover's decided and we start getting the carts the books are going to be put on. So any other? Yeah, that looks like in chat. Any other questions? Okay, let me stop the recording.